Hi, everyone. Welcome. Well, one of our most controversial shows was on structural care. That was almost a year and a half ago. And it was titled, I Am Mad About Self Care. We learned something. Peter, my co host, taught us something that day that self care is actually an illusion. It puts the burden of taking care of oneself on the individual and shifts the responsibility away from employers. And as you can imagine, this is not good. So, if you're mad about self care, then I would recommend you stay for the next 30 minutes as we talk about what organizations should be doing to help their employees be better.
Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Coffee Time with Masterminds. My name is Peta Blakely, and I'm the founder and principal of Blakely Consulting.
Welcome to Coffee Time with Masterminds. I am Cynthia Rojas, founder and principal of To Your Growth.
Welcome to Coffee Time with Masterminds. I'm Rebecca Tuttle, founder and principal of Grant Right Now and Grant Writing for Good.
Hi, everyone. Welcome again. Peter, how are you today?
Hanging in there. How are you?
I'm good. And I want to welcome our listeners, including our listeners in Australia. How exciting. But we have listeners all over the world. And this is also our 80th show. So I just want to celebrate that moment because we were both saying how amazing this is and that this is the year we go into 2 years of doing Coffee Time.
Yeah, soon.
Coffee Time turns 2 years old. This is amazing. This was supposed to be a 6-week show.
Yep.
All right, Peter. This is your house. You still a year and a half later feel very strongly about structural care versus self-care.
I think I feel more strongly about it now than I did last year or any time before. And let me say why I initially said that I was mad about self-care was, this is fairly early in the pandemic and everybody is super stressed. We're still super stressed, but the experience of being super stressed was relatively new, right? The upended work environments, the lack of childcare, the lack of toilet paper in the stores, like all of that was fairly new. And people were saying things like, well, make sure you take care of yourself, take a bath. And I thought, this is ridiculous, right? This is ridiculous. We're asking people to keep functioning through this environment, right? Through these times. And then we're placing this burden on them to do something else to make themselves feel okay about it. And that's what made me so mad. There's, now that we've talked a little bit more about it and looked into it some more, there are, I think, 3 levels of care, 3 or 4 levels of care for us to think about. And one is simply self-soothing, right? And I'm very reluctant to give concrete examples because what's soothing to one person might be care to another and vice versa. But, if you're stressed and you go take a walk around the block, that is more like self-soothing, right? That is like it's very useful, but it's temporary. It's not addressing the underlying, causes of your stress or anything. Then there's self-care, which has been completely commercialized. So self-care involves spending a lot of time on money, on gym memberships, gurus, inspirational speakers, master classes in vision boarding. There's this massive self-care industry. And I do not at all mean to malign serious self-care or to say these things aren't important, but you end up with kind of like going on a diet or giving up drinking in January. people just feel guilty because they're not self-caring, right? This is just another task to feel stressed about, that you're not keeping up with the self-care. And that's completely counterproductive. But the bigger issue is, some of these problems are caused by outside structures, right? Are caused by, this isn't your trauma. You're picking up trauma at work because you work with traumatized people, right? Or you are exhausted because you work 80 hours a week and then you care for family members. That's structural. Like, that's not a personal flaw or failure of your time management. And to suggest that you should take another hour to do yoga to deal with that stress is ludicrous and mean. It's just mean,
I
right?
love that. It's
So
mean.
let's have a different conversation, right? About, I think, two things, right? Cooperative care and structural care. Cooperative care is something like, I pick up some of your burden, right? And that is dropping off a meal to a neighbor who's having a hard time, covering for you at work, that kind of thing. And then there's structural, which is, why are you even in this problem, right? So what can we as a country, or we as a workplace, do to remove these barriers to your being healthy and okay, right? And there we get to things like single payer healthcare, or universal affordable housing, or universal childcare, or employers filling in those things where they're missing, right? So can an employer just say, hey, we're going to require everybody to take 6 weeks of vacation every year because that's what you got to do when you work here, right? Can an employer just say, look, it's very stressful to work here, and everybody is going to have to go to some kind of mental health support, and you're required to do it during your work hours, and you must go twice a week, and we pay for it,
Yeah.
right? Why aren't we having those conversations, right?
I read an article recently about the concept of the 40-hour work week, and how it's rooted in a way of living that we no longer conform to. And I thought this was really interesting about how at the time that this was designed, there were two-parent households where a family could live off of one income. And so
And there was a perception that was true.
yes.
Right.
Yeah.
And I think that was that was a white, middle class, heterosexual model, which
Yeah.
unfortunately we tend to think is like the acme. But there have always been lots of families that weren't doing that. You're right, though, it was possible in that era to do that, right? For one wage earner in the household to, buy a house, have a car, and pay for vacation every year.
Yeah.
That's
And
not
so
anymore.
I appreciate you lifting this idea that way of life fit for a small group, and unfortunately became the way of being for, or was supposed to be the way of being for all groups.
For all, yeah.
But
Workers.
things have changed. They've changed so much, right? Many of us need a two-income household. Families look very different these days. There's a sandwich generation that I don't know if we had it 30 years ago, 40 years ago, but we have people taking care of children and grandchildren and their parents all at the same time, many times in the same household. Things that 40-hour work week just doesn't make sense anymore.
Doesn't make sense. And it particularly, doesn't make sense for those of us who haven't, who used to go to an office but haven't gone there in 2 years.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I have to tell you something that has always been a pet peeve, but now has become very obvious to me. I'm looking for a new doctor, so I'm making a lot of phone calls, and every place I'm calling is only open from 9 to 5.
Right.
And if you go to the bank, it's 9 to 4,
9 to 5.
right?
Yep.
And if you go to other places, and so it's like, well, how are we supposed to navigate the other parts of our lives?
Right.
And so this is why this starts to make less and less sense and becomes a burden to the employee.
Yeah.
Which is what you've been saying all this time.
Yep. Yeah, I remember the first time I had a job where I didn't work on Friday afternoons, and how life-changing it was that I had time to go run these errands during business hours on Friday, which meant I actually got an entire 2-day weekend,
Yeah.
right? And I have strongly resisted working on Fridays ever since. I just don't think people should work on Fridays.
And so what year was that, Peter? Just to get
That was like 2001.
Wow.
It was a
That
long
was
time
20
ago.
years ago.
It was a long time ago. Yeah.
Wow. That organization was ahead of its time.
I'm not sure that it was organization wide. I think it was kind of a verbal agreement between me and my boss.
We won't tell anybody.
But there's something to be said for that. Like, why would the organization have had any other policy, right? Like, given my responsibilities, right? Given that I did not do the type of work that had to specifically be done on a Friday afternoon, everybody who does that kind of work should have that kind of flexibility.
So let me ask you something, and I'm going to put something in the comments. What should a work week look like? Let's start there. Let's start with the structure, right?
Right.
What do you envision? I mean, we talk to organizations all the time. What do you envision would be a good balance? That's another word that gets overused.
Yeah. And it depends what kind of work you're doing, because obviously some people, have to work at very specific times. Some kinds of workplaces need a certain number of staff at every hour. But for those of us whose job is mostly being at a desk, right, writing stuff that's not direct care and things like that, I think your work week should look like whatever you want, right? I think there's no particular reason that we have to work a certain number of hours. I think we should think more in terms of what do we need you to accomplish in a week, right? So an interesting conversation on LinkedIn the other day that asked, if you're not going to the office anyway, and you finish your 8 hours worth of work in 6 hours, what do you do with the extra 2 hours? Are they yours, or do you owe them back to the employer? Right. And there was an interesting conversation about it where some people said, well, obviously you just move on to the next task, right? There's always plenty to do. And other people who said, well, why should I be penalized for being that much more efficient? And, can't I go take a nap, do my personal stuff? I fall more on the camp of it's your time, right?
Yeah.
I mean, let's invert this conversation, because we tend to talk about the time that employers give us to do our personal stuff. Let's talk about it the other way. Let's say you actually have all of the time, right? You, the worker, owns all of your time, and you elect to sell some of it to the employer. So what are the terms of that? Are you selling it hour by hour, or are you selling it based on your products? Those of us who are self-employed talk about that a lot,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
And how we sell our consulting services. But let's the rest of us think about that. How many of your hours do you actually want to sell? And do you want the basis of this conversation to be, okay, I will sit in my desk for 40 hours a week? Or do you want the basis of the conversation to be I get it. Here is the job description. And yes, I can do that for you for X dollars a year.
I love that. I love that thought. We have a comment from Thaddeus, a very good friend of ours who was on our show.
So good to see you. Yeah.
Yeah. And he's coming to us through LinkedIn. Do you want to read that, Peter?
Said our agency implemented a policy of no meeting between 12 and 1. So people can come together if they want to, and no emails before 7 a.m. and after 6. to limit expectations of employees checking email throughout the evenings or early mornings.
I love that.
So, I mean, like simple structural changes. And that's another thing that we haven't really talked about is, boundaries and modeling, right? And that's an important thing that organizations and leaders can do is, manage expectations. What the people who are the most able to work all the time do becomes the expectation in the environment, right? That's how we all ended up working 40 hours a week and commuting to work and all of that, right? But if those people make a rule that we don't email in the evenings, then everybody is off the hook for checking email in the evenings.
Yeah.
Right? If those people say your lunch hour is important and I am going to protect it, I'm not going to make you, the lower wage, lower authority worker, defend your own lunch hour. That has a huge effect in the organization.
Yeah. Well, I have to tell you, in my search for this new doctor, all these doctors' offices are closed during lunch.
Good for them.
I know. And I thought, wow, talk about modeling good behavior, right?
Yeah.
Aren't our doctors always talking about boundaries, talking about balance, all those words? And I happened to call during my lunch hour.
Right.
But they were all closed. I said, well, that taught me something, right? We have a comment from Myra. Let's see. Myra's another friend of the show. All right. Peter, can you read that?
Sure. Businesses have commercialized self-care, but self-care is so much more than that. And it doesn't have to cost a penny. My self-care doesn't cost a thing. And yoga is not for everyone. Hear, hear. Yoga is not for everyone. Just like working out is not for everyone. For example, I hate to work out, but I love to walk, and that's my workout. Many think that meditating must be quiet when meditating is just about focusing on something or just yourself. I do agree there are different levels of self-care. Yeah,
Yes.
absolutely. And I have heard, so I know Bell Hooks talked about caring for herself as an act of protest. I've heard that that's where the term comes from. And if that's the case, we got it way wrong. Like, that's a dramatic misunderstanding of what self-care is. Right.
Well, I'll tell you something. This is very interesting. So we know Myra. She's been a viewer on the show from the very first day. Myra works in a school district, and she handles crisis management, right? And so, Myra, it would be interesting to hear from you this concept of structural care, and you are a leader of a unit. How do you um, infuse structural care and not put the burden on your staff? Because your work is the exact kind of work that we're talking about. This idea of your employees could be vicariously traumatized. And is it up to them to learn how to meditate? Or is it up to the institution to create ways for them to deal with their work appropriately?
Right.
Yeah.
And to create the space, right?
Yes. Yes. What are some examples, Peter, that you've seen?
Well, physical space, like a meditation or prayer room in the building. Practices like making sure that everybody takes breaks. Practices like modeling that it's okay to get up from your desk and take a walk in the day, right? Letting your staff see you leave the office and go take a walk during the day. Encouraging people to leave at 5:00, right? Or virtually to log off. What else can we think of? Creating a culture that doesn't glorify being in meetings a lot and being very busy and having a full calendar, right?
Right. Unless your job is meetings.
Unless
unless
you're a meeting facilitator.
well, I
Yeah.
used to lead strategy, and so
Mhm.
people that do a lot of strategic work are constantly in meetings, right?
Right.
But what you're saying is that don't be very careful not to have a to-do list where you are, um, 30 hours in meetings per week,
Right.
but you still have 30 hours worth of work,
Right. Right.
right?
And what
You
tends to
don't.
happen is people say, "Oh, I've got so many meetings. 20 hours of my week is spent in meetings." Um, but it's just kind of this badge of honor. Nobody's doing anything about it.
Right, right.
A more proactive approach is, here's something that I was taught about planning a meeting. When you invite people to the meeting, tell them why you're inviting them to the meeting. So the invitation email is really long. It says, Cynthia, I'm hoping that you can attend because we need your perspective about X. And we're going to ask you to why. If you can't describe why each of those people is coming to the meeting, then you don't invite them to the meeting.
I love that. Peter, you're always changing my life. I love that
I mean,
idea.
how many meetings would you not be in if somebody had to clearly articulate what you were there for?
And Google Gmail, and I do
Yeah.
know not everybody uses Gmail, but there is a space for notes,
Yeah,
and
right.
you can even put it there.
You
I
could put it
love
there.
that idea.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Tell
there's
me.
an organization that I learned it from that like the rule in their organization was, if the person who's invited you to the meeting hasn't done that, has not explicitly said what you need to do at this meeting, then you're under absolutely no obligation to attend. And that's that. Yeah.
Wow. Wow. Okay. And so Myra, you wrote a cryptic message unless I missed.
Myra says she still has AOL.
We love AOL. And last year when we were talking about this, we had Tom King on the show, who is an executive director and really was very honest about experiencing burnout and being
Mhm.
able to change the work that he does, right?
Yeah.
Which has made him very conscious and a much better leader. But he said something that I want to read, if that's okay, because I
Yeah.
think it's important. He was talking about taking care of our frontline staff, right? And
Mhm.
paying attention. Many of them are people of color,
Yep.
and they choose human service jobs because it's embedded in their DNA. We want to do great work.
And the people closest to the work are going to be the best at doing the work.
Yes.
Yeah.
And then he says you are a hero and heroes don't get
Mhm.
tired. Now he's talking about perception.
Right.
And that's true. And we want, as leaders, it's our responsibility to make sure that that's not happening, not to
Right.
glorify this martyr, this hero martyr, this sense of
Right.
heroism
Right.
to the expense of your own health.
And it becomes an excuse to really be abusive to workers in the extreme case. Well, we do the really, really important work, so we're not necessarily going to get paid a living wage. We're not necessarily going to have
Right.
retirement savings. We're not necessarily going to have, you know, the right tools to do our jobs, the physical infrastructure that's really respectful to us, right? Um, and I say that's just lazy, right? If your if your staff are subsidizing your business model by spending extra time on a task because they don't have the technology to do it, right?
Yeah.
um, Going to the chiropractor after work because they sit in this broken down office chair that you got donated 10 years ago, right? Your business model isn't working, right? And let's talk about like some other more concrete examples. Using their own cell phone during the day to do their community organizing work, driving their own cars or riding their own bicycles and not getting subsidized when they work in the community. They're subsidizing the organization,
Yeah.
right? By nicks and cuts. Your business model doesn't work. Like we need to have a more robust conversation about that.
Yeah, I completely agree. Thaddeus says he loves that too. This, I think he's referring to this idea of Tom King's statement about, watching out for our staff and
Mhm.
making sure that in praising their great work or
Right.
validating this idea of they are heroes, they really
Mhm.
are, that not to make that damaging to their health and to
And
really,
it's also going to, marginalize people who, different people have different amounts that they can work, right?
yeah.
Either because they have other responsibilities or because they have health care or they have disability or, what else. So let's not create a structure that highly values people who can be productive for really long hours, which is, young, healthy, childless people, right? And values them over other types of people with diverse demands on their time and energy.
Yeah. Yeah. I think this is great. So we're going to have a series. So this is, I should have said this in the beginning, but this is the first of a series of conversations about structural care. And we will be talking to some individuals, leaders, in how they are instituting structural care into their organization. And our hope is to learn from them. But I think, Peter, I love your thinking outside the box. What if we lived in a work world where we made up our own hours and it was based on
Mhm.
projects and not time?
Right. I mean, given the capacity that we have now to communicate across space and time, the idea that we all have to work simultaneously just doesn't really make sense,
I
right?
know, I know, I know.
It makes no sense. Um, and it's again, a relic of when people had to come into the office and interact with the equipment, right? In the office,
Yeah,
because that's where the loom was or something like that. But now that we've all got computers and phones in our houses, I'm not sure that it makes any sense, right? That there's any reason for it.
yeah. I do want to say one thing because I think I came upon this years and years ago. Is structural care is not necessarily bringing a yoga instructor. I can't say the
Mm-mm.
word. A yoga person
Right,
into the workplace an hour before the day begins or an hour
right.
after the day ends or during lunch hour. That is not what we're talking about. This is really
Yeah.
important because I think employers mean well when they do that. But those kinds of activities usually result in low participation because, again, you are asking me to show up an hour earlier, right? And I'm already commuting or I'm
Right.
doing a bunch of things in the morning. You're asking me to stay an hour later, or I'm switching
Mhm,
my lunch hour for yoga. And so, what we're talking about is
mhm,
really institutionalizing
mhm.
care in a way that does not at all put the burden on the employee. And that is what we're going to be talking about in the next couple of weeks. Any
Really
last
exciting.
words, Peter? This is, I tell you, this is a topic you said recently. I could talk about this for weeks.
I really could. I really could, and I'm really excited that we're going to be talking about it for weeks, because I think we're gonna learn a lot.
Yeah.
Um, and, we're just getting started with our thinking on this, but the implications for, uh, issues of equity are huge. The implications for how we think about nonprofit work are huge. And now is the time, right? We have talked multiple times on this show about how the context of COVID and all of the negativity that's around that, but also the opportunity that lies in crisis. Um, Everything's on the table. All of our routines are disrupted. Now's the time to talk about it.
Yes.
So,
I love that. And
yeah.
if we could bring Tom King back, that would be great because now he's had a whole year of COVID, and it'll be really
Through
interesting
this.
to learn from him what were some of the things he did. So we're at the end of our show, and we want to thank everybody for watching us, and also for those who participated in the conversation. Renee, Myra, Thaddeus, thank you so much, along with our listeners in Australia. And Peter, have a wonderful weekend, and we'll see everyone next week.
Have a wonderful weekend, everybody.
Take care.